You don't exist. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowed like sis. Did it perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look me better. Put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheap again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of What If Deku Enters Kengan Ashura. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of the Nexus 97 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Jaku Park. Thud. 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 The sound of something hitting a tough surface was the only thing you could hear in Jaku Park. No children running around screaming. No background hum. No fuss or deafening noises. Nothing. The park was deserted. Nothing strange or out of the ordinary, being sunrise. In the midst of this idyllic scene, only one person could be found. A child. No older than 6 or 7 years old. He was wearing an ordinary white tank top and black shorts. His peculiar features were without a doubt the freckles on his face and his hair. Emerald curls held together in a bun by a black ribbon. The boy hit the trunk of one of the numerous trees present in the park. On its surface one could see the numerous marks and scratches left by the repeated punches of the child. Again. He repeated in his head. Aga dash. Crack. The boy stopped the moment he heard the ominous sound. Approaching the trunk he was hitting and inspecting it carefully, he noticed a small crack in the wood. Yes. The boy exclaimed before collapsing unceremoniously on the grassy ground. Only then he realized that he was literally drenched in sweat. After taking a few minutes to regain his strength, the little boy stood up and approached the battered tree, and behind it he pulled out a small bag from which he extracted a fluffy towel with which he dried the veil of sweat that lingered on his body. Phew. Finally. I can't wait to show T dash. Behind you. Upon hearing those words, the boy immediately dropped the towel and turned suddenly to the source of the voice. He was quick enough to intercept the chop aimed at his forehead, blocking it with his left forearm. Great reflexes, kid. The boy looked away from the hand that was about to hit him, and looked at the attacker. He smiled. Thanks, Niko. The man chuckled and withdrew his hand. However, something mischievous shone in the adult's eyes. You're wide open. Niko lowered himself so quickly that he seemed to have teleported, and with an equally quick sweep of his legs, he sent the boy to the ground, who grunted in protest. Ow wow, that's not fair, Niko. You're right, but it is fun. Niko burst out laughing, while the boy pouted. Once he calmed down, Niko helped Izuku, now 7 years old, to get up by giving him a hand, and only then he noticed the red and swollen knuckles on the boy's hands and remembered the reason for his visit. He took the backpack he kept on his shoulder and from inside pulled out a small ice pack, which he handed to the boy, who nodded gratefully. While Izuku dabbed his aching hands with the ice, Niko approached the tree that his son, even after 2 years, it was strange to call Izuku that way. But it was a good kind of strange, was hitting, and he immediately noticed the small crack on the trunk. Niko whistled, impressed. Well, I'll be damned. You did it. Izuku looked up from the ice pack and smiled. It took a while and a lot of punches, but yes. I did it, Niko. Niko approached the boy and, after kneeling down, put his hand on his head and began to ruffle his hair affectionately. Niko. Not the hair. It took me forever to do it. Nope. You will receive the Tokita head pat and you will enjoy it. The two chuckled, then Niko got up and looked at Izuku. Now you are ready. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Ready? Ready for what dash? Realization hit the boy like a truck. Really? Niko's smile widened so much that he resembled a Cheshire cat. It's time to awaken the tigers. After leaving the park, father and son found themselves in front of what appeared to be a common gym, only slightly larger than the others. Actually, it was gargantuan. Izuku felt almost intimidated by the enormous size of the building, but he still took courage and followed Niko inside. The interiors were furnished and decorated like a classic gym, mats, training bags, equipment and weights of various types and numerous mirrors placed on the walls. Perhaps the thing that caught the boy's attention was the large ring in the center of the room. Izuku turned to Niko, who had just finished talking to a receptionist. Niko, where are we? Is this the place where you will teach me that? Niko nodded with a smile. That's right. The owner of this gym is an old acquaintance of mine, and he has given us permission to use one of the rooms to train. Niko went back to the reception desk, where he signed some papers. After that he took Izuku with him and went to one of the areas covered with mats. During the short journey, Izuku glanced over one of the walls, where what he supposed was the name of the gym was written in capital letters. Kuresi Dojo. Hey kid, you good? Izuku nodded, and hurried to join his sensei. The two sat cross-legged facing each other on one of the mats. Izuku tied his hair again in a bun, in preparation for what he took for granted would have been a harsh training. Once finished, he turned his attention to Niko, who was staring at him with a serious expression. A very serious expression. A little too serious. Was it getting a little cold in the room or was Izuku just imagining it? The boy was about to break the overwhelming silence, but Niko beat him to it. The Niko style. Izuku widened his eyes and swallowed. The Niko style. The martial art to which I have devoted practically all my life. My style. And now. Niko smiled and poked Izuku on the forehead, which by now had become a habit, much to Izuku's chagrin. It's the style that I will pass on to you. The style to which you will dedicate all, or at least most, of your life. This martial art will help you on your way to becoming a hero, but above all on your way as a fighter. Izuku nodded, captured by Niko's speech. In a way, your training for the Niko style has already started. The boy took on a puzzled expression. How? Niko grinned and raised his right hand, showing his back. Izuku watched him for a few seconds, and felt the famous light bulb turning on atop his head. He raised both his hands and turned them over, noting his red knuckles filled with cuts and scratches. The trees. Niko lowered his hand, satisfied. You finally figured it out. Hitting those trees had another purpose, other than to improve your overall form. Now that we have passed the initial phase, let's start getting serious. Niko jumped to his feet, and Izuku followed soon after, eager to begin. But before that. Thud. Huh. Izuku looked at his feet and noticed a book, previously absent. Curious, he took it to inspect it. A grammar book? Exactly. Should I start punching bee books instead of trees? Why, of course not. Niko sighed. And he knelt in front of the boy. Izuku, how old are you now? S6. Nope. 7. Oh. And do you know what most children your age do? Izuku didn't like the turn the conversation was taking. You Yes. They go to SS school. Exactly. Izuku lowered the book he was holding, and looked away from Niko. Do you want me to go to S school, Niko? Niko watched Izuku shiver. He sighed. Yes, Izuku. I care about you and I want the best for you, but I can't allow you to put aside your education to throw yourself headlong into the world of martial arts and fighting. Not to mention the fact that no hero school would accept you that way, quirkless or not. Izuku seemed to deflate, and Niko understood that. After all he had gone through and having finally found a safe, welcoming and worthy place to be called home, being thrown into an environment where everyone hates just for existing was terrifying to say the least. Luckily Niko had already thought of a backup plan. He grinned. "Boo, what if I told you that you can study and get an education without going to school?" Izuku looked up. How? Simple, you will study at home. So you can dedicate yourself to your workouts and school without compromising. Izuku's eyes seemed to lit up. Will you teach me, Niko? Niko shook his head chuckling. Of course not. I'm smart, but not smart enough to be your tutor. Izuku tilted his head, perplexed. Then who? Niko nodded towards the exit, and the boy caught the message. Another old acquaintance of mine. She's waiting for us at home. Izuku swallowed nervously, but Niko comforted him by placing a hand on his head. Don't worry, you'll be in good hands. The boy calmed down and left the building, Niko behind him. On the other hand, I'm the one who should be nervous. Niko's sweat dropped. The two arrived at the Ashura's den, and Izuku immediately felt comfortable once within the confines of what was now his home. He and Niko took off their shoes at the entrance and started to enter when a voice interrupted them on the spot. You're late. Izuku winced at hearing the unknown voice, and instinctively went to hide behind Niko, but stopped beforehand. He heard Niko chuckle sheepishly. Forgive me, I was at Mitsuyo's to do some things and to show Izuku the place. The aforementioned child came forward to better see the stranger and to introduce himself properly. At the right moment too, as the intruder, a woman, got up from the place where she sat to approach the two. She was a petite young woman with large dark eyes, black hair gathered in a neat bob hairstyle with well-cut bangs that fell right over her eyes and full small lips. She was wearing a traditional kimono decorated with a floral motif. You're 10 minutes and 17 seconds late to be exact. But it's an improvement since it's you. The woman sighed and Niko chuckled again, before turning to Izuku. Izuku, this is the person I was talking you about. She will be your private teacher for your studies and all the stuff related to school. Izuku hesitantly approached the woman and looked at her in the eyes. And nice to meet you, M.I.M. My name is Izuku Tokita and, you I hope we will get along. The boy made a small bow. The woman looked at him for a couple of seconds before introducing herself. Likewise. I'm Shunka Seishu. She gestured to one of the sitting booths at the far end of the room. If that's okay with you, I prefer to start right away. I have to get an idea of your level as soon as possible in order to better prepare our lessons. She turned her attention to Niko. We will occupy one of the seats at the back of the room, so as not to disturb your customers. Niko smiled and nodded. No problem, Shunka. All of my regulars know little Izuku by now. Shunka nodded back and went to sit, Izuku followed her. Once seated, the two began their preliminary lesson. Shunka Seishu is not the type of woman who is easily surprised or shocked. And it could not be otherwise, given her troubled life. She went from a normal student to the head of one of the most profitable companies in the country. Not to mention the fact that she's married to a police inspector who is also a pro-hero. However, when Niko Tokita, the object of her husband's obsessions regarding his jobs, contacted her a few days ago for a matter of extreme importance, she couldn't help but be surprised. And the surprise did not end there, since she learned that Tokita had adopted a child, a quirkless child, and he wanted her to be his private tutor. Obviously, given her position as CEO of Wakasa Life Insurance, she couldn't accept that, but something about the child intrigued her. And how could he not? He had managed to catch the attention of Niko Tokita, one of the most moronic, fierce and dangerous men she has ever known. But knowing the man, he could very well have kidnapped him. Better not to think about it. I don't have to give Okoya more reasons to feed his paranoia. Shunka shook her head slightly and concentrated on the boy sitting across from her. He was intent on reading one of the numerous textbooks she had brought with her and transcribing notes on a separate sheet. She couldn't help but notice the boy's battered hands, especially the knuckles. For now, however, she was surprised, but in a positive way. Izuku Tokita, for his young age, was very smart and observant. Sure, every now and then he asked for clarification on some topic that he was struggling to understand, but once explained to him, he completed it without problems. But his hands. Shunka was not stupid. In her mind he had already conceived numerous theories as to why Niko had adopted a kid. But the simplest one was also the most obvious. An heir. She knew that Niko had long been looking for an heir, a student, a pupil to whom to pass on the knowledge of the Niko style, otherwise it would have died with him. And the fact that this heir is also quirkless, seemed very weird. Now, Shunka had nothing against quirkless people. Indeed, they were completely indifferent to her, as were those with quirks. But of course the fact that he doesn't have a quirk of any kind would limit him a lot compared to those who have one. It's a fact. Seishu-san. Shunka was interrupted from her musings by Izuku's almost silent voice. Yes. I'm done. Shunka nodded and took the boy's notes and gave them a quick reading. She hummed in approval. Then she looked up at Izuku, and the boy fidgeted slightly on the spot. Izuku-kun, would you be so kind to leave me a few minutes alone with your father? I have to ask him a couple of things. Izuku smiled shyly back and left the table. Shortly afterwards, Niko arrived and took his place. Hey Shunka, how's it going? At what level is the little one? He's a smart and attentive young man, that's for sure. With the right guide he will have a bright future ahead of him. Niko chuckled and scratched his cheek. Ah, I'm glad that you think so, and Izuku will surely be happy to hear it. I'm going to call him, so maybe we'll have a cup of tea and talk about recent ev-. But that's not what you want for him, is it? Niko stopped and stood staring at Shunka with his mouth open. After a few seconds, he closed his mouth and smiled sadly. Heh. Nothing can be hidden from you, huh? In that aspect you are identical to your husband, you know. So I've heard, yes. Niko sighed. Look, I know what you're thinking, but it's not like that, you have to believe me. Shunka raised an eyebrow. Enlighten me, then. Niko sighed again, then told Shunka the story of his meeting with Izuku. Throughout the story, Shunka remained unmoved, listening carefully to every single detail. Then she opened her mouth. So in summary, you saved a quirkless child who was on death's door while he was trying to escape from his disastrous existence, and you offered to help him not only in teaching him martial arts, your martial arts, but also in following his dream to become a hero. Without a quirk. In my defense, said that way, anything would sound stupid. Stupid? The plan itself isn't bad. In fact, it's admirable. I didn't think you were so smart to conceive such a thing. Thanks. You're welcome. But have you thought about future plans? More precisely the media reaction to a possible quirkless hero. And you know whose reaction to your relationship with him? Niko frowned. Should I care? As far as I know, everyone who is not part of the association sees me as a failed killer of the inside who runs a restaurant. A good restaurant, if I may add. What about Izuku? I will not speak for him. Izuku is young, yes, but he is determined and capable, you said it yourself. He has gone through hell because of what he is, something completely out of his control. He must decide whether to face and overcome it or drag it behind him like a burden. In any case, we made a promise, and I'm going to keep it. Niko got up from the table and went for the stove. People will always talk, Shunka, you should know it well. Quirkless or not. And what about the Niko style? Niko took a classic Japanese teapot, filled it with water and put it on the fire. I'm just teaching him what Geo-sensei taught me, that's all. As far as I'm concerned, once he becomes a hero, Izuku can do whatever he wants with the Niko style. He can teach it to the next generation, or forget it completely, but honestly, it's up to him. A few minutes of silence passed before Shunka asked another question. Are you sure? About what? The Niko style. Are you seriously implying that your broth dash? Crash. Shunka winced at the loud, sudden noise. She turned around and her eyes widened. Niko had completely obliterated part of the wall by hitting it with the back of his hand. Before she could question Niko, she was hit with such vicious bloodlust that she felt short of breath. Niko turned around, and Shunka noticed the fierce, almost animalistic look on his face. She started to sweat. Don't you dare, Shunka. She swallowed. Call me an idiot as much as you want, but in this place, in my house, you must never, and I mean never, mention that man. Niko pulled his hand out of the wall and turned off the stove. He stopped being my brother since that night. He took a deep breath and calmed down. The atmosphere in the restaurant returned to being breathable, and Shunka looked down. Forgive me, that was rude of me. Niko sighed again and went over to the first table with some tea and some snacks. No, sorry, I just overreacted. He sat across from Shunka and the two took a cup each. A rather unnerving silence fell, but it was still better than the previous situation. For what it's worth, you have my support. Niko looked up from his cup. Excuse me. Niko's eyes widened to see one of the rarest sights in the world. Shunka Seishu smiling. A warm and genuine smile. I will help Izuku with his studies. As I said, he has potential, and with your guidance, he will become a formidable fighter. I am curious to see if he succeeds in his dream of becoming a hero. Niko smiled. Now you're just trying to make me cry, aren't you? No, it wouldn't be very decent. Shunka finished her tea and collected her things. Well, we can finish here today. Thanks for the tea and tell Izuku that I will be here for our lessons from Monday to Saturday at the same time of today. Niko heaved a sigh of relief. Thank you so much, Shunka. I'll let him know. He accompanied the woman to the door. By the way, I haven't asked you yet, but how's your husband? Akoya is fine. Always busy with his work, but he's fine. And what about his, how to say it? Issue? Shunka sighed. Well. Meanwhile. Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department H.Q. Slam. A colossal pile of papers, manila folders, reports, strong drives and USB sticks was dropped roughly on a dusty desk. Dusty like the rest of the room, after all. Looking at it closely, the place was the classic room you would find in an abandoned and haunted building. Dark, moldy, dusty, chock full of cobwebs and other CRP. In the middle of this chaos there was a young man. He was in the middle of his 20s, tall, with short black hair and rectangular eyes. He was trying to shake off the dust and catch his breath. After making himself presentable, he went around the desk on which he had placed all the material he had collected in the last few hours. Sir, Huff, this is all the material on Niko Tokita that, Huff, I was able to find and gather. A figure got up from behind the giant pile on the desk, obscured by the darkness of the room. And he kept getting up. Again. And again. Until, finally, the mysterious figure approached the young man, coming out from the shadows. From the darkness emerged a muscular and bulky man with an angular head, sharp facial features and pronounced cheekbones, focused eyes, thin black eyebrows and black hair combed backwards in points pointing backwards. Good job, Tsukachi-kun. Now I need you to bring me all the files and articles related to the time frame when Niko Tokita lived in the inside. Quickly. The Colossus gave the young man, Tsukachi, a bunch of keys and gestured with his head towards one of the sections of the archive. Tsukachi hesitantly reached out to take them, but before doing so he addressed the man in front of him. Seishu-san, with all due respect. Is all this really necessary? I mean, we have been coming to this dusty archive forgotten by the gods every day for information on this man, Niko Tokita, because you believe that he is one of the worst criminals that ever existed. But frankly, we have nothing that can corroborate your concerns, so, isn't it about time we stop dash? Naomasa Tsukachi-kun. Tsukachi jumped and felt like he was shrinking under the austere gaze of his superior, and he turned his eyes away. Do you know what this is? The man held out his hand to his subordinate, and Tsukachi noticed the police badge in his superior's hand. Your badge. Precisely. And do you know what this badge means? That you are a police inspector dash. No, it means I don't give a SHT. Now go back to work. Tsukachi grunted in exasperation and disappeared into the darkness of the archives. Shortly thereafter, the man, Akoya Seishu, sat down in the desk sieged by the paperwork and went to work. I'll toss that son of a beach in the coldest, deepest and darkest cell I can find, if it's the last thing I do. The Azura's den. Let's just say that he's very dedicated to his job. Shunka sighed in exasperated fondness. Niko smiled, and after another exchange of pleasantries accompanied Shunka out of the door. He closed the sliding door of the restaurant and leaned against it, sliding on the floor with an exhausted air. DMN. I really need to control myself better when his name comes out, or him in general. Kriak. Niko was interrupted from his musing as the door that gave access to the private rooms on the upper floor opened slowly. It was slightly ajar, but he could still see the small emerald orb eyeing the room, until resting on the man sitting against the restaurant door. The door opened, and a very fidgety and somewhat frightened Izuku emerged from it, who hurried to reach Niko. Niko, is everything all alright? I heard SS shouting and then there was a big noise and the house shook and I thought you and Seishu-san got into a fight and then dash. Niko poked Izuku on the forehead, interrupting his muttering. It's alright, kid, nothing bad happened between me and Shunka. It's just. Niko raised the hand with which he had torn the wall to pieces a little while ago, dripping BLD on the floor in the process. Bad memories came back to me and I took it against the poor wall. He chuckled. No harm done, tough. Don't worry. Niko burst into one of his classic laughs, but after he recovered, Izuku was nowhere to be seen. Huh. He looked around the room. Kid. He called for him. Izuku. Nothing. Then he heard something rummaging in one of the lower kitchen cupboards and before he could get up to investigate, Izuku appeared from behind the counter with what appeared to be a small emergency kit. Before Niko could ask the boy about his intentions, he was interrupted. Niko, why your hurt? Your hand eye is bleeding. We have to medicate it before it gets worse or becomes infected. Niko simply stared at the boy with a raised eyebrow, but did nothing to stop him, simply letting the boy work. Izuku began by inspecting the hand, and started treating it to the best of his abilities. Which weren't bad for a 7-year-old boy. Niko looked at his freshly medicated hand in surprise. Wow, color me impressed, kid. Where did you learn to treat wounds so well? Izuku blushed after hearing the compliment and sheepishly looked away. I learned by myself at the orphanage. The nurses there weren't particularly committed to medicating my wound, or the other kids in general, so. Niko frowned. I see. Niko rose from the floor and motioned for Izuku to follow him. Well, it's an extremely useful skill, especially in the field of martial arts. Or heroism. Izuku nodded and, understanding the adult's intentions, took an apron from the kitchen counter that he wore and a white band that he tied on his hair, holding them firmly in place. Then he washed his hands in the kitchen sink and returned to Niko, who in the meantime had already performed a similar routine. He turned to the boy. Okay, then. Now let's think about preparing dinner, and tomorrow the Real training will begin. Why yes, sir." The two smiled at each other and went to work. Cooking has never been a priority for Izuku. And there was nothing strange about it, being a small kid. However, if they were to ask him about the memories that most frequently came to mind when thinking about his parents, they were those related to cooking. In particular his mother, Inko, while she was perpetually in the kitchen cooking breakfast, lunch or dinner. And then there was his father, Hisashi, intent on listening to his wife while he was reading the newspaper and enjoying a cup of black coffee. Izuku was still wondering how the heck he could drink that bitter stuff. He also remembered when his mother cooked his favorite dish, katsudon, when he behaved well or when he felt down. So when he found out that among the other things, Niko also wanted to teach him to cook, he was clearly surprised, not by much, tough. After all, his adoptive father ran a restaurant. Niko justified it by saying that a fighter must take into account what he puts in his body in order to perform better on the ring, and that therefore learning to cook his own meals was a must. Izuku accepted without giving it much thought. Although he tried to ignore the little voice in his head whispering that Niko probably wanted a sous chef to help him in his restaurant, given the sudden influx of customers in recent weeks. Despite all that, Izuku found the experience to be quite pleasant. Cooking gave him a deep sense of calm and concentration, as when he devoted himself to hitting the trees in the park. Speaking of hitting things, Izuku lied if he said that he was in no way nervous about the prospect of starting the actual training that Niko had in mind for him, not to mention the study sessions with Seishu-san. But they were still more preferable to the alternative, namely to go to school. With other children. With quirks. Izuku sighed. Him being quirkless was clearly the biggest obstacle he will face not only in his dream of becoming a fighter and a hero, but in life in general. Sooner or later he will have to leave behind all the things he has gone through and learn to make his lack of a quirk his strong point. Just like Niko told him, and even before him, his father. Remember kid, never forget what and who you are. Because the world won't. Make your quirklessness become your armor, and it can never be used to hurt you. Izuku's eyes hardened with determination as he was peeling some daikon. What was it for? Sushi. He had completely forgotten about it. Wait. What was he thinking about? Oh yeah, his upcoming Niko style training. The Niko style. Niko style. Emichim. Izuku glanced at Niko, who was in the midst of filleting a salmon. Okay, now he was pretty sure the dish they were making was sushi, with a serene but concentrated expression on his face. Niko didn't tell him much about the martial arts style that bore his name, and he didn't make the effort to ask him about it, not wanting to pester him about it. Izuku shook his head, getting rid of any inappropriate thoughts and focusing on his work. After having dinner, taking a quick shower and preparing his stuff for tomorrow, Izuku went to bed. Maybe tomorrow at the Kuresi dojo we'll receive some answers. Hopefully. Meanwhile. Seishu abode. See. Shunka sighed as she sank into the living room sofa. Between the various morning meetings concerning her company, the tutoring session with Niko's son and other afternoon meetings, she was completely exhausted. She took a few minutes of idleness on the sofa, before getting up and preparing dinner for her and her husband, who will certainly return again in the middle of the night after another day spent looking for incriminating evidence on Tokita. Once she was done and ate her part, she put Okoya's on the counter. Finally she went to the bathroom to take a long and well-deserved hot bath. She came out wearing a set of fluffy pajamas while drying her hair, leaving a vapor path behind her as she sat down on the sofa again and started preparing the schedule for the study sessions with Izuku. A couple of hours later she was interrupted when she heard the sound of the front door slowly opening. After a few seconds the imposing, and exhausted, figure of her husband emerged in the living room. Completely covered in dust and cobwebs. She sighed. It would be superfluous to ask you what you would prefer between a bath and dinner, yes? Okoya stood motionless for a few moments before uttering a reply. Please. She sighed again. The water is ready. Go clean yourself up and put your clothes and uniform in the laundry basket. The man obeyed silently and disappeared into the bathroom. Shunka resumed writing her study program and ended shortly thereafter, just as her husband left the bathroom. He was wearing an ordinary white t-shirt and sweatpants. He sat next to his wife on the sofa and the two remained motionless on the spot. Pomph! Until Akoya fell to the side, ending up with his head on Shunka's lap, who let out a slight groan of pain from the sudden impact. However, she did not complain or try to remove Akoya's heavy head from her legs, simply sighing again, but this time affectionately. By now she was more than used to her husband's antics. "Bad day?" she asked, her hand almost instinctively ended up in Akoya's hair, who grunted in response. "To put it mildly. I searched the archives of the HQ from top to bottom, collecting more dust and spider bites than evidence on Tokita. I swear, it's as if that man doesn't exist. What about Tsukachi-kun? It's been a while since I last saw him. How is he?" Halfway between an aneurysm and a nervous breakdown. Shunka giggled. In conclusion, a day like any other at the HQ. Akoya grunted in exasperation and twisted, moving his head to the side to look at Shunka from below. "And you? How was your day? Didn't you have to go to see Tokita in the afternoon?" Shunka nodded. Akoya's eyes seemed to light up. "How did he seem to you? Suspicious? Indifferent? As if he was hiding something? And how did he treat you? Well? Bad? He attacked you? Threatened you? Extorted money? Did he try to give you some suspicious pill? Or maybe a plastic bag containing a seemingly harmless white powder? In this regard, how were his eyes? Where the dash? Pinch. Ow. Akoya's interrogation was interrupted by Shunka, who pinched his cheek. Then she looked at him exasperated. "Niko Tokita did nothing wrong in my presence, Akoya. Resign yourself. We only talked about future private lessons that I will do together with Izuku-kun and Dash." "Izuku? Who's that?" Shunka stopped immediately and looked at her husband with wide eyes. "Wait, are you telling me you don't know?" Akoya narrowed his eyes. "Know what?" Shunka heaved the longest sigh of the day. "DMN it, Tokita." She tried to put on the most neutral expression she could, then spoke. "Niko Tokita, that Niko Tokita, has adopted a child. His name is Izuku Tokita, formerly izukumidoriya. He saved him from a gang of thugs while wandering aimlessly in the alleys of the inside. He took a liking to him and took him under his wing. He plans to pass down the Niko style to make him an affiliated fighter and a hero. And just to make you participate in this small detail, Izuku Tokita is quirkless. Was the child healthy? Was he injured? Did he look sick to you? Or malnourished? Was he clean? How were his cloth dash? Chop." Once again Akoya was interrupted, but this time by a chop on the forehead delivered by a very frustrated Shunka. "Akoya, please." The man rose from his comfortable position on the sofa and from his wife's lap, heading for the kitchen. "I need a drink." Shunka rolled her eyes. "Aren't you exaggerating a little bit? He's just a kid, not a puppy of some rabid wild animal." Akoya returned to the living room with 2 cans in his hand. A beer for himself and juice for his wife. Shunka didn't drink alcohol. "You want to know how I feel about it? Let's just say that it would be more reassuring knowing Tokita is raising a T-Rex puppy than a human being. Unbelievable." He took a long sip from his can, then turned to Shunka. "You obviously refused to be part of this nonsense, did you?" Shunka raised an eyebrow at the abrupt question. "Before I answer, why do you call it nonsense?" This time it was Akoya who raised his eyebrow. Hello. We are talking about Niko Tokita, one of the most dangerous men around, you know. The affiliated fighter who in the last association tournament faced and almost killed the Fong, remember? I don't see how someone like him can be a good father, least of all a teacher. Not to mention the fact that the child is quirkless. Is the last thing such a problem for you? Akoya shook his head, then drank again. There are a lot of good agents at the station. Good people. Men and women. Some of them are quirkless. But that doesn't change my opinion of them, or that they are excellent cops despite their condition, for lack of a more appropriate term. Akoya finished his beer and placed the empty can on the table. Do you know that many of them wanted to be heroes? But for obvious reasons they had to fall back on other jobs. More realistic and achievable ones, they said. Nobody wants, or needs, a quirkless hero. At least, that's the general opinion. Shunka looked down at her still-closed can. And what is your opinion on the matter, Akoya? Akoya looked his wife in the eyes. The same. I have nothing against quirkless people. I don't consider them less human, monsters or other degrading stuff. The boy wants to be a fighter. Very well, he has my support for what it's worth. There are still dipshits in the association that make quirks their reason for being, but the fighting traditions are mostly the same as they used to be. But a hero? No. Akoya got up and after taking his can, he threw it in the trash in the kitchen. Contrary to what people think, being a hero is not just punching a few villains and smiling at the cameras. It is a noble and ignoble job at the same time, especially if you are the kind of hero I am. Shunka stood up, her can completely forgotten on the living room table, and joined Akoya in the kitchen, embracing him from behind. Akoya continued. He won't survive a week on the field without a quirk, Shunka, and you know it. And this is assuming that he can graduate from a hero school in the first place. The couple remained motionless for some time, then Shunka broke the silence. I accepted, Akoya. To be honest, I only did it out of curiosity. I want to see how far Izuku-kun will go to make his dream come true. And Tokita. I think he wants to somehow atone for what happened with his brother. Akoya stiffened and seemed to almost growl. That fiend. Maybe instead of Tokita, you could try to have him imprisoned. Akoya turned and looked at his wife. Oh, I will, trust me. I have never stopped looking for him since that night. And when I'll find him, I'll dismember him limb by limb before locking him in the darkest and deepest cell of Tartarus. Shunka leaned against him, burying her face in his chest. She sighed again. Can we talk about it in the morning? Let's go to bed for now, I'm barely standing. Akoya nodded, exhausted as well. Of course, sorry about that. Help the boy if you want. I just hope you don't regret it. Shunka smiled slightly and, after taking her husband by the hand, led him to their bedroom, retiring for the night. The following day. Kuresi Dojo. Niko and Izuku found themselves back in the gym of Kuresi Dojo, sitting cross-legged while facing each other. Izuku wore a white tank top, black shorts with green trimmings and had his hair tied in his now trademark man bun, while Niko was wearing a black tank top and sweatpants of the same color. Izuku had prepared a notebook with a pen. In case there had been particularly complex or technical aspects of what Niko was going to teach him, taking notes would certainly help. Niko instead was in the middle of scribbling something on a white sheet, and after a few minutes he finished, turning the sheet towards the floor, hiding its contents in Izuku. Then he took a deep breath, sighed and looked up at the boy with his trademark smile. Well, here we are. And this time for real. Niko took on a more serious expression. Now, my dear pupil, I bet you're wondering what is the Niko style. Izuku nodded. Well, in short, it's the style created by my sensei, Geo Makaku, you remember him, don't you? Izuku nodded again. Although Geo-sensei never revealed to me and to my brothers, that is, his other students, the true origins of the Niko style itself, he told us that it is a martial art that descends from another martial art, now completely extinct, since there are no longer practitioners of that style and all the knowledge about it is practically non-existent nowadays. Scribble scribble scribble. Izuku's hand moved quickly to keep up with the explanation. Niko continued. Starting from that martial art, Gayo-sensei developed the Niko style. He himself defined it more practical and versatile, even more modern, compared to the style it originated from. But what is it that makes it so special, compared to other martial arts, like traditional karate or Chinese kenpo, for example? Niko took the first sheet and turned it over. Izuku stopped writing and went over, looking at the contents. Izuku tilted his head, clearly confused, then looked at Niko, who just nodded. At first glance it may seem confusing, but trust me, it's simpler than it seems. Tell me Izuku, do you know what katas are? Or forms, when it comes to martial arts? The boy shook his head. Katas are the various fighting styles that are implemented in a martial art. Some focus on certain types of approach to better fight an opponent, others implemented melee weapons, such as sticks, nunchaku, knives etc. Niko pointed the sheet with the diagram on top. What makes the Niko style truly unique are the 4 katas that make it up. The adamantine kata, the flame kata, the redirection kata and finally the water kata. And you, little Izuku. Niko put his hand on the fluffy head of his pupil. You'll learn them all. From first to last. Now the first thin dash. Scribble scribble scribble. Huh. Niko looks confusedly at the source of the sound, and he noticed Izuku quickly writing in his notebook. Very quickly. Too quickly. Was that smoke coming out of the tip of the pencil? Niko sighed fondly and poked Izuku's forehead. Ah. The boy stopped slaughtering the pencil and recovered immediately. Why yes. Learn all 4 katas. Got it. Niko smiled broadly and jumped to his feet. Excellent. Izuku got to his feet too, then asked his sensei a basic question. Niko, which kata should I learn first? The man in question nodded in approval, expecting such a question. I was hoping you would ask me, kid. I thought about it a lot, taking into account various factors, such as your physique, your age and the fact that you don't have a quirk. Izuku stood motionless, paying attention to his sensei. So I've decided that for now we should focus on 2 katas in order to gain the upper hand on quirked opponents. The adamantine kata and the redirection kata. Niko motioned Izuku to follow him to a part of the gym, one with numerous training bags hanging on the wall. Now, an explanation of both. The adamantine kata is the form focused on the offensive, but also on the defensive part of the Niko style. It involves the hardening of the muscles to increase the strength of your attacks and to better tank the blows of your adversaries. Niko looked around, then scratched his head sheepishly. I would give you a demonstration, but I don't think the owner wants me to break down another wall. Another. Izuku's sweat dropped. Anyway. Izuku, do you remember the first day of training at Jaku Park? When I hit that tree. Izuku smiled shyly. Of course I remember, how could I forget? Niko grinned. The technique I used to hit that tree is called Iron Breaker, the most basic move of the adamantine kata, in which the muscles of the hands harden to deliver a devastating blow. Niko showed the hand to the boy and squeezed it so much that it almost turned bright red, with extremely thick veins sprouting on the back of the hand. Izuku seemed almost hypnotized by the scene, resuming writing almost immediately. Obviously, it will not be easy to have such a fine control of your muscles right from the start, so you will have to apply yourself, both physically and theoretically. Shunka will help you with the more technical aspect of this kata. And even the others if you want. Izuku finished writing just in time for another question to pop up. And the redirection kata? What is it about? Niko's smile widened to alarming levels. Izuku felt a shiver run down his back. Hit me, Izuku. www what? Hit me. It will be easier to show it than to explain it to you. Izuku hesitantly put down his notebook and pen and stood in front of Niko. Remember the punches you used against those trees? Try hitting me with one of them, as strong as you can. Aim wherever you want. Izuku, still hesitant, nodded, and assumed the familiar position while spreading his legs. He inhaled. He exhaled. Hiya. And he punched, aiming at Niko's abdomen. He never hit him. He didn't know exactly what happened next. Except that he found himself lifted from the ground. And then slammed HRD on the floor mat. Oof. The air left his lungs when he hit his back on the ground and his head was spinning slightly. Whoa, hey. You okay, kid? I didn't throw you on the ground too strong, did I? Izuku shook his head to regain his senses, then looked in front of him and noticed the upside-down figure of Niko looking at him worriedly. No, I'm fine, but... What happened? Izuku got to his feet and turned to his sensei, who looked at him carefully and crossed his arms. So, Izuku. Can you tell me what exactly happened? The boy stood motionless, trying to recreate what had happened in his head. I punched as strong as I could, but I didn't feel my hand hit the target. Izuku cupped his chin. But I did feel Niko grab my wrist and then, as if from nowhere, I found myself in the air and then. Izuku began to mutter in a low voice in an attempt to analyze the situation. The muttering beast was born. Niko looked at him. Impressive, although a bit creepy. Finally, Izuku stopped muttering and turned to the adult. You deflected my attack, but I can't understand how. Unless yo dash. I didn't use my quirk. Izuku's eyes widened before frowning. Then he sighed resignedly. Then I don't how you did it, sorry. Izuku looked down, dejected. Niko simply approached the boy, kneeling in front of him. Hey, don't worry about it. You're here to learn and I'm here to teach you, right? Izuku looked up, smiling slightly, then nodded. Niko nodded back, then stood up. Weeping Willow. Izuku looked at him in confusion, before Niko elaborated. It's the name of the technique I used. You see, kid. Niko raised his hand again, making various movements with his fingers and wrist. This is the essence of redirection kata. Using minimal movements and manipulating the flow of power to turn the opponent's attacks against them. Niko chuckled. Actually, this is my favorite kata, but only because it combines perfectly with my quirk. He burst out laughing, and Izuku's eyes widened by alarming proportions, before shining brighter than the sun. He approached Niko, and with a new notebook in his hand, asked him the question he wanted to ask him from that night when he met him. Sensei. What's your quirk? Niko stopped laughing and watched the boy stare at him with an expression of innocent curiosity, mixed with wild excitement. Niko grinned. You want to know what my quirk is, huh? Yes. Ever since we met, I wanted to ask you, but I didn't want to be intrusive. Niko chuckled again, then motioned Izuku to come closer. Well, in that case. Here we are. I can tell you that. Yes. My power. Go on. Is. Please tell me Aurea dash. Poke. Ow. Izuku recoiled and instinctively touched his forehead, where something strong had just poked him. He opened his eyes and saw Niko with his trademark Cheshire Cat grin and 2 fingers raised. A secret. Niko. Izuku yelled with his small voice, before pouting, upset at being deceived like that. Niko burst out laughing again, and even Izuku couldn't keep a small smile from forming at the absurdity of the situation. After another big laugh, Niko wiped a tear from one eye and looked at the boy in front of him. Ho, ha, DMN. It's too easy to fool you, little Izuku. He ruffled the boy's hair, who pouted again. My quirk in itself is not much, just so you know. But I will tell you all about it later, when you are bigger, stronger, more experienced and most importantly. Niko smiled, but this time in an almost disturbing and, to say the least, glacial way. If you can beat me at least once. Gulp. Izuku swallowed instinctively, but luckily, the malicious aura around his sensei disappeared almost immediately. Perfect. Now that we've laid the foundation, we can start. Niko knelt again, and smiling, spread his arms. Are you ready to suffer the pains of hell, Izuku Tokita of the Niko style? Izuku smiled so widely that he felt his cheekbones hurt. Why yes, sir. Kuresi Dojo. Get up. An adult voice commanded. Ugh. A child, no older than 10, was writhing in pain on the cold, dusty ground. He was completely covered with wounds, some bleeding, and fresh bruises. Long, curly emerald hair, now completely stained with dirt and a little bit of blood, eyes of the same color, but now almost dull. He tried to lift himself off the ground by pushing himself with his arms, but he could not find the strength, and collapsed unceremoniously to the ground. I said get up, Izuku. Ngh. He tried to get up again but failed again. We're not done here. Get up. Izuku Tokita, 10 years old, lay wounded at the feet of his adoptive father and teacher, Niko Tokita. The child, now on the verge of losing consciousness, began to take deep breaths, trying to remain awake. Niko just watched him. His gaze as strong and inflexible as a block of granite. That's it. No reply. Niko sighed, shaking his head. Okay, then. We're done for today. We'll resume after you recov dash. Hiya. Izuku took a deep breath. He placed both hands on the ground and, with immense effort, brought his knees close to him. Then he pushed. Ga-arg. Slowly, and painfully, Izuku got up, until he stood on shaky legs. Niko raised his eyebrows, surprised. Oh. The child raised his equally shaky fists and took his stance. Huff puff. He was breathing heavily. Huff puff huff puff. He blinked constantly. He had to stay focused. He had to stay awake. Huff puff. Don't allow yourself to be shaken. Don't weaken your stance. Open your senses. And don't let your guard down for a moment. He inhaled. Then he exhaled. His breathing was now even, but his limbs still trembled. Well, that's a start. Izuku fixed his gaze on Niko, who in turn took his stance. Their stance. They stared into each other's eyes for several seconds, maybe even minutes, who knows. Izuku smiled wobbly. I'm not done yet, sensei. Niko remained impassive for a few seconds, then his face contorted into the now classic, Tokita grin. That's my boy. They charged at each other. Seiken. Right pectoral. Thud. Blocked. TCH. Hisoku. Left lateral knee. Swish. Dodged. Dang it. Pirouette. Then MP to the chin at the end of the spin. Whoosh. Niko grabbed Izuku's forearm in the middle of the spin, stopping him. Then he tried to knock him out with a quick leg sweep, but Izuku managed to avoid it by jumping. Shuto. Left elbow. Thud. Hit. Once he landed from the jump, Izuku stepped towards the adult. 1. Right side. And then dash. Thud. Ngh. Niko grunted slightly as the blow hit his side, but he barely flinched. That moment of distraction was enough for him not to notice Izuku pulling his left fist back. Squeeze the muscles in the hand as much as possible. Harden it as strong as you can. He inhaled. He exhaled. Iron breaker. Wham. Ugh. Niko took a few steps back, holding his stomach reflexively. Thud. Then he looked up. Izuku seemed to have collapsed right after throwing his iron breaker. Concerned, he walked over to the boy, and noticed that he was breathing heavily as he stared at his left hand, the same one he had just hit him with. He was smiling. Haha. I did it. I hit him. Now I see how. Izuku winced in pain and started to get up but was interrupted when he felt a hand resting gently on his head. Well done, kid. You did really good today. He smiled and ruffled the boy's hair, who answered weakly. K. Niko chuckled and picked up the boy, putting him on his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, but still being careful not to hurt him. Come on, that's enough for today. Let's go get those wounds treated, and then we'll go home. What do you think, kid? Izuku squirmed slightly in protest. No. I don't want to go see Hanafusa-sensei. Niko burst out laughing. Me neither, kid. Me neither. Later. Taito University Hospital. Aoseowa Ward. DMNet. Niko sighed, rolling his eyes. Despite having known each other for several years, he was still not used to Hanafusa Hajime's eccentric side. Who at the moment seemed in the throes of a hysterical fit, as he squirmed and screamed on the floor. Doc, aren't you exaggerating a bit? That question seemed to completely freeze the doctor. Exaggerating? Well, I dash. Exaggerating? I don dash. Exaggerating? Dude, calm down dash. In the blink of an eye, Hajime was in front of Niko, grabbing the collar of his shirt and starting to shake him violently back and forth. You show up here in my office with your son completely covered in wounds and in a world of pain and ask me to medicate him as if nothing had happened. Do you have any idea what you did? You have damaged a rare and prized specimen of a quirkless child. What if his internal organs had been damaged beyond repair? Have you thought about this? And what about Dash? I wanna die. Meanwhile. Okay. What about here? No, not really. Okay, then. Here. Nah. Amicham. Then. Poke. I would say that's a yes. Izuku blushed as the nurse who was visiting him giggled slightly, tenderly ruffling his hair. She was a fair-skinned, attractive young woman, of short stature, with a rather round face. She had long blonde hair that she kept tied in a bun, with two shorter pieces that framed her face and aqua-blue eyes with noticeable upper lashes. Izuku looked down, embarrassed. I'm sorry, Yoshizawa-san. The nurse gave him a smile. Don't worry, Izuku-kun. You're not the first patient who tries to act all tough in front of a nurse, you know. And I already told you, you don't need to be so formal, you can call me Kokomi. Izuku smiled back, nodding. Kokomi lowered herself to the child's level, closed her eyes and gently placed her hands on the sides of the child's head. Then she placed her forehead against Izuku's, who closed his eyes. Good boy. Now. A golden aura pervaded the kind nurse, but then spread to the boy, who immediately relaxed once in contact with the light. Perhaps a little too much, given the effort he made to keep his eyes open and to stay straight and not let himself fall on the hospital bed he was sitting on. Kokomi-san. SSSH. It's okay. Kokomi Yoshizawa. Quirk. Soothing aura. Description. Kokomi's quirk allows her to emanate an aura of soothing energy that dulls/weakens the senses of those who come into contact with it. Pros. Although it has no healing properties per se, her quirk is ideal for reducing the pain of her patients, allowing her to medicate and visit them more easily without harming their wounds. Cons. Soothing aura can only affect one person at a time, and even then, prolonged use greatly depletes Kokomi's stamina. Kokomi gently shushed and lied him down on the cot and took the necessary meds to start dressing his wounds. Kokomi-san. You haven't told me about your quirk yet. Izuku pouted slightly, but the nurse just chuckled at the boy's behavior. Not now, Izuku-kun. Now rest while I treat your wounds. Amichim. Izuku nodded weakly and closed his eyes. A few minutes later. Spinal cord integrity in the hay, are you listening to me? Nope. I lost you when you started to mention something about the mucous membranes. Hajime was about to retort but was interrupted by Kokomi's arrival in the room. She was holding a small first aid kit, the same one she had used a while ago to medicate Izuku. She put away the aforementioned kit, then returned to the room with the two men, stopping in front of Niko. She opened her mouth to speak, but... No. She was promptly interrupted by Niko. Kokomi pouted and stomped her foot. You don't even know what I was going to say. Niko sighed. I don't need to. Kokomi-chan, ask me as many times as you want, but I won't give Izuku to you. But dash. Listen, why don't you take a stroll within the inside? I'm sure you'll find an orphan to adopt and take home with you. But they'll never be as cute and cuddly as Izuku-kun. Kokomi squealed, starting to sway in place, flowers all around her. Seriously, being that adorable should be a crime. Niko groaned, and suddenly felt more tired. Does this hospital have normal people working in it? Or am I some magnet for creep shows? Then he thought of all his acquaintances and friends. Yeah, definitely the latter. Niko left the mad doctor and his assistant alone, deciding to go check on Izuku. Just thinking about the boy made him smile like an idiot. DMN, kid. Much could be said about Izuku Tokita. He was a shy, reserved, anxious child who struggled to have even the simplest conversations with strangers or people he knew recently, although, to be fair, he was getting better little by little compared to when they first met. He was also reluctant to open up to others because of his quirklessness, and who could blame him, given what he had been through, and always feared some aggressive reaction from others. And he tended to mutter. A lot. Yet, despite these flaws, Izuku Tokita was quite possibly the smartest and brightest child Niko had ever seen. He was able to grasp concepts and situations quickly and react accordingly. Not only in terms of his private lessons with Shunka, but also in learning the Niko style. Or martial arts in general. In just 3 years, by massacring himself at Kuresi Dojo and against Niko, Izuku had almost completely mastered the redirection kata and was on the verge of learning the more advanced techniques of the adamantine kata. However, Niko noted that Izuku tended to favor the former. He chuckled. Like father, like son, right? For the time being, Izuku's progress was remarkable. The only thing that worried Niko was the child's social life. In particular, the one concerning his peers. Izuku was having a strong time socializing, but even the other younger dojo-goers weren't trying too strong to approach him. But frankly, he wasn't sure if he wanted Izuku to hang out with that kind of people. Sigh. Somehow, someone spread the rumor that a quirkless boy was attending the Kuresi dojo. Some of the regulars there, mostly the hotheads, immediately set out in search of their next victim to torment or to show off but backed off immediately when they found out that the boy was under Niko Tokita's wing. That Niko Tokita. At least now father and son were not in danger of being harassed. Although, unfortunately, they could not avoid the usual comments and jokes whispered not too quietly about the quirkless freak. When it happened, Niko wondered if good old dear Mitsuya would be sorry for having to pull a couple of battered corpses out of the lockers in the changing rooms. Niko sighed heavily. What the F is wrong with people? Shaking his head slightly, he tried to free himself from the negative thoughts, focusing instead on the more positive ones. I could cook him some katsudon to reward him. Niko found himself without realizing it in front of Izuku's hospital room and was about to enter, but then he heard voices coming from the room. One from Izuku. And the other from a stranger. A very young stranger, if his hearing didn't deceive him. Earlier. Izuku's hospital room. Izuku woke up from his short nap, noticing the recently completely clean and medicated wounds. He still felt a slight discomfort coming from them, but it was still a great improvement over what he was like when he entered the hospital. Kokomi-san is amazing, as always. Izuku smiled slightly. He was certainly not an avid frequenter of places like hospitals or doctors' offices, but it was inevitable to be there frequently given the turn his life had taken. And, to be honest, he was starting to find comfort in the routine that led him to be visited by Kokomi Yoshizawa and Hajime Hanafusa basically every day. Over time, he had begun to appreciate the two, despite their eccentric behaviors. By the way, Izuku looked around and noticed to his left a bedside table with his things on it. In particular, a yellow shoulder backpack. From inside he took out a small green notebook along with a pencil. On the cover it bore a hand-written title. Martial Arts Analysis for the Future No. 3. Once in his hand, Izuku opened it and started writing. I managed to hit Niko by using Iron Breaker with my left hand. In this regard, I noticed that he always tends to be slightly exposed on the right side. Is it a deliberate gesture to bait me into attacking, or is it his weak point in terms of his fighting form? Learn more. Scribble 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 scribble. Niko told me that I have to try not to rely too much on the redirection kata, but also on other forms once I have learned them. I think I am well on the way of fully learning the adamantine kata, although I should stop for the moment the training for indestructible. Niko says that right now I don't have enough muscle mass to mitigate enemy attacks. Scribble mutter mutter. Which form will he make me learn next? I'm pretty sure it will be the flame kata. If I can somehow combine it with the redirection kata, I will have a very significant advantage over my opponents. As with the water kata, I think I have to get bigger to be able to execute and maintain grappling or SBMSN techniques effectively. Mutter 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 mutter. Maybe I can dash. Hey, are you okay? Gah. Izuku jumped in fright, throwing his notebook and pen into the air, but they were grabbed by the stranger who had surprised him before they hit the ground. Turning quickly, he noticed the intruder sitting in a chair next to his bed. He was a boy, about the same age as him. He had a round, youthful face, blonde hair styled in a bob cut and blue eyes. The latter were undoubtedly its most distinctive feature, having slit-shaped pupils, like those of a feline or a reptile. He also noticed that he had 3 fingers on his right hand splinted. The boy just stared at him, before smiling broadly. Izuku, still stunned by what had just happened, stared back at him, like a deer under the headlights. After a while, the silence became too awkward, and Izuku tried to strike up a conversation. Hello. The boy nodded, answering. Hi. Okay. Nice. So far, so good. You can do it, Izuku. Izuku cleared his throat slightly. Sikan I aya as dash. I'm Cosmo Imai. But my friends call me Cos. Nice to meet you. Or maybe not. The little boy, Cosmo, reached out to offer Izuku a handshake. Something wrong? Izuku looked down at Cosmo's outstretched hand, which he followed with his eyes. He realized too late that he had given him the hand with splinted fingers. Oh. Pft. SNRK. The two boys tried and failed miserably in the attempt to hold back the laughter, bursting out laughing loudly and heartily. After a few seconds, their bellies aching, the two calmed down. Ha. Who? Oh man. Anyway, sorry. You know, conditioned reflex. Heh, don't worry. Izuku smiled and offered him his right hand. I'm Izuku Tokita. Nice to meet you, Imai-kun. Cosmo took his hand and shook it enthusiastically. But now Izuku had to ask him something that had been buzzing in his head ever since he noticed the boy in the room. How long have you been in here, Imai-kun? Cosmo shrugged. A couple of minutes, I think. I was looking for my sensei after they fixed my hands. He raised his hand with the splinted fingers to emphasize. But then I heard some ominous muttering and I got curious, and here I am. You were so distracted that you didn't even notice me opening the door. Cosmo chuckled, while Izuku scratched his head sheepishly. Ah. I'm sorry, it's a flaw of mine since, well, since forever, actually. But I'm working on it. Then Izuku remembered a detail of Cosmo's answer that intrigued him. Wait, did you say, sensei? Cosmo nodded. Yup. Izuku then fixed his gaze on the body of the child beside him. At first glance he looked rather thin, but looking more closely he could see the slight defined musculature. He also noticed the numerous calluses on his hands and slightly bruised knuckles. Then of course there were also the splinted fingers. It didn't take long for Izuku to put two and two together. Do you practice martial arts, Imai-kun? The question seemed to have caught the blonde off guard, as he opened his eyes wide and stood still staring at Izuku. Imai-kun. Cosmo seemed almost petrified. He was sitting completely still. Then he narrowed his eyes. Imai-kun, is Everett dash. Whoosh. Thud. It all happened fast. Too fast. Out of nowhere, Cosmo threw a punch with his left hand, straight into Izuku's face, but he managed to block it with the back of his hand. Those reflexes. Cosmo thought. I knew it. You're the quirkless kid. Huh. Izuku, still stunned by what had happened, belatedly recorded Cosmo's exclamation, who was instead beaming. Yes. You're him. I had heard that a new student had joined the dojo, and that he didn't have a quirk. At first I didn't want to believe it, because I had never heard of someone born without one, but then Kuresi-sensei explained to me that there are people like that, but they are very rare nowadays, so I was curious to meet him but I could never find him in the dojo because I had heard that he was training with another very famous and very strong fighter and then I wanted even to know him even more and then blah blah blah. Cosmo kept talking, but Izuku was even more confused. Dojo? Sensei? Kuresi? Does he also train in the same dojo that Niko and I go to? Blah blah blah. Then I hit him in the unmentionable because he didn't want to tell me who you were and I was very angry, so I challenged a guy older than me and in the fight I dislocated 3 fingers, so I went back to Kuresi-sensei who brought me here to splint my fingers and then blah blah blah. So that's how I look and sound like when I start muttering. Izuku's sweat dropped but decided to bring Cosmo back to reality. And because he was pretty sure he was running out of oxygen, given the bluish color his face was taking on. But before he could speak, the door to the room the two were in swung open, and a man entered. He was a young adult, perhaps in his 30s or less, with a youthful hairless face and a notably muscular and well-defined body. His long red hair were tied into a ponytail with 2 long bangs framing his face and he had a long thin scar crossing his face horizontally. The individual looked around with a slightly alarmed air, judging by his expression, before settling on the 2 boys, in particular on the blonde, whose face was now purple, and breathed a sigh of relief before smiling. Then he slowly approached Cosmo. He raised his right arm. And he hit Cosmo in the back of the head with a chop. Ow! The blonde turned quickly and furiously, and at the sight of his attacker, he pouted indignantly. Sensei! That's cheating. The man, Cosmo's sensei apparently, chuckled before raising his arms in an exaggerated gesture of indifference. Hey, that's your fault. You were wide open. This conversation seems strangely familiar to me. Izuku thought, before slightly shaking his head. Then he looked up at the teacher and his pupil. Cosmo had somehow climbed onto the adult's back and started biting his shoulder as some form of retaliation, but the former was impassive before noticing the other child in the room. His expression was one of pleasant surprise. Izuku-kun. I didn't know you were in here. He walked over and ruffled the boy's hair. Izuku made a small sound, similar to a pleased noise, before addressing the man. Likewise, Kuresi-san. I haven't seen you at the dojo for a while. Is everything alright? The man nodded while smiling and, after removing Cosmo from his shoulder, he put him under his arm, like a sack of potatoes, and answered. It's okay, don't worry. I had stuff to do that kept me away from the dojo for some time, including. Kuresi squeezed Cosmo lightly with his arm. Not strong enough to hurt him, but enough to make the blonde grunt a little, and he pouted in response. Training this little pest. I assume you've already introduced yourself, yes? Izuku nodded shyly. Imai-kun dash. Cosmo. Huh. Cosmo looked at Izuku with a beaming, almost vibrating expression. Imai makes me sound older. Like this geezer. He pointed at Kuresi with the thumb of his left hand, who in response stood still with a smile on his face. Except for the throbbing vein that sprouted on his temple. Squeeze. Ack. Show respect to your elders, Cos. Before a new discussion/struggle between teacher and student could arise, Izuku took the opportunity to intrude. I just met I'm Cosmo-kun, Kuresi-san. He caught me in the middle of one of my, moments, then I asked him why he had splinted fingers, but then he threw a punch at me and. Izuku's eyes almost began to shine. I managed to block him by a whisker. Luckily Niko trained me to improve my reflexes or he would have hit me. Speaking of wick dash. He did what now? Rumble. Both Izuku and Cosmo felt their blood freeze in their veins. When they dared to look at Kuresi, they noticed the same serene and happy expression with his eyes closed as before, but this time a large throbbing vein had appeared on his temple and crossed part of his forehead. Slowly, Kuresi turned to Cosmo, still trapped under his MSTR's arm, and in a sickly sweet voice, he opened his mouth. Cosmo, did my ears fail me, or did you actually hit a recovering child in his hospital bed? By now, with all the sweat that Cosmo was excreting, you could fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. I didn't. I am mean, YYUCI, actually, it's a pretty funny story, now that I think about it. Oh. Squeeze. Ow. 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 Wheeleel. Okay. Okay. I threw a punch at him, but he blocked it. I just wanted to see if he was the quirkless kid everyone was talking about in the dojo. Kuresi raised an eyebrow. Everyone. Cosmo nodded. Yes, everyone. They said that a quirkless freak had joined the dojo and they wanted to meet him to teach him a lesson and. Cos. Then they started looking for him, but they never found him, so they were sure that he had thrown in the towel because he was weak and that without a quirk he wouldn't have made it far in the dojo, then. Cos. They learned that he was Niko Tokita's pupil and they were even more angry, because it is known that a lot of young fighters have begged Tokita-san to take them as his students, but he always sent them away, so they decided that they would teach the quirkless kid a lesson so Tokita-san would realize he was wasting time training someone like him. Cos. So I became curious too. If Tokita-san chose him as a student, he must be really strong, even if I've never seen a person without a quirk, so I dash. Cosmo Imai. The aforementioned child stopped speaking immediately upon hearing such a stern tone from his MSTR. He felt himself shrink when, looking into his face, he noticed a dark and austere expression. Cosmo swallowed audibly and when his teacher nodded at Izuku, he followed his gaze. Izuku was still there, on the hospital bed with his back propped up. But he looked miserable, with dull, downward eyes as he squeezed his hands so tightly that his knuckles blanched. Then he took a deep breath, almost resigned, and looked out the window. In silence. If guilt was an arrow, then Cosmo Imai would have been a dummy for target practice right now. I didn't. I mean. Kuresi just shook his head, clearly disappointed with his student's behavior. Izuku-kun, I humbly apologize for my part, as well as for my students and Cosmo. Kuresi started to bow. If I had no dash. It's okay. But he was interrupted by Izuku. Looking at him, Kuresi noticed the smiling expression on his face. But it was clear that it wasn't a genuine emotion that was behind his it, but something else. Resignation. Don't worry about it, Kuresi-san. I'm used to it. Used to it. Used to it. Used to it. I see. The man rose from his almost bow. Still, I'd like to have a chat with my students at the dojo, and as for you. Kuresi turned to Cosmo with a glare, which made the boy swallow even harder. We will discuss your behavior and choice of words in private. Cosmo looked down, clearly ashamed and feeling guilty. At that moment, the door to the room opened a third time, and Niko Tokita made his appearance. Kid, are you okay? I hear dash. He broke off when he saw the occupants of the room. Kuresi smiled widely as he saw him. Niko. How long? And what a coincidence, too. We were just talking about you with your protégé. He approached and held out his hand, which Niko shook friendly, smiling back. Mitsuyo Kuresi himself. I heard you disappeared somewhere to train your own pupil. Niko looked at Cosmo. I assume it's the trembling blondie behind you. Trembling. Kuresi turned, and indeed, Cosmo was there, trying in vain to stop the incessant shaking of his knees. He chuckled. Yeah, well. Try to understand. Sometimes, to keep him good and well behaved, would tell him about the most absurd fights you took part in particular the final of the last association tournament. Niko scratched his head and chuckled, embarrassed. It sure wasn't my brightest moment. Hey, at least you came out with both eyeballs, unlike you know who. Don't remind me, I still feel guilty about that. The two adults burst out laughing, while the two children looked at them in confusion. After some more pleasantries, Kuresi adopted a serious expression, and turned to his friend. Niko, would you mind if we went out for a moment? I have to talk to you about something. Niko raised my eyebrows, surprised by the sudden change in attitude. Of course. Everything okay? Kuresi sighed. Not really. But I'll explain properly once we're alone. Before following Niko out of the room, Kuresi turned, his expression stern and unyielding, to Cosmo. Behave yourself. Cosmo nodded vigorously and he and Izuku found themselves alone in the room. The silence was palpable and suffocating. Neither dared to speak after the recent exchange of words between the previous occupants. Izuku, feeling partly responsible, gathered the strength and courage to start the conversation, or any conversation really, just to restore a minimum of ease in the room. See Cosmo-kun, about earlier, don't feel guilty about it, like I told Kuresi-san, I'm used to it by now. Hearing people talking behind my back is nothing new to me, so really, it's ALRI-. No it's not. Cosmo interrupted Izuku, who looked at the blonde. He was stiff as a pole, with his arms at his sides and his hands closed in shaking fists. He was clearly upset, but despite everything, he took a deep breath. Then he bowed in a perfect 90 bow. I'm so sorry for everything, Izuku-kun. Cosmo closed and narrowed his eyes. I'm sorry for what I said. And also for what others said at the dojo. I was so taken with the prospect of being able to fight someone skilled that I lost sight of what Kuresi-sensei taught me. Humility and respect are two of the fundamental pillars of martial arts, and I have failed them. And for this. Cosmo, impossible as it might seem, bowed even further. I apologize. Izuku was left speechless. The sincerity and genuine emotion behind Cosmo's apology was something he had never felt before. After all, none of the people who had insulted him, or worse, for his quirklessness had had the decency to apologize, or even just think that perhaps what they had done was wrong. So it was a refreshing feeling. Maybe. It certainly wasn't unpleasant. In any case. Izuku smiled. I accept your apology, see Cosmo-kun. Cosmo rose from his bizarre position and looked Izuku in the eye. Really? Yes, really. Izuku rose from his position, grunting slightly from his wounds, and sat on the edge of the bed, his feet dangling. Then he reached out his hand to Cosmo. Let's start over, okay? I'm Izuku Tokita, nice to meet you. Cosmo looked at Izuku's extended hand. Then he smiled and shook it vigorously. Cosmo mai. Hope to see you in the ring one day. After a few laughs, the two began to talk about this and that, losing track of time. Meanwhile. So, let me get this straight. You saved a quirkless child who was on death's door while he was trying to escape from his disastrous existence, and you offered to help him not only in teaching him martial arts, your martial arts, but also in following his dream to become a hero. Without a quirk. I don't know about you, but this conversation feels awfully familiar. What? Forget it. Niko pinched the bridge of his nose, exasperated. Mitsuyo instead, let out a short chuckle, before turning again to the man in front of him. Why didn't you tell me? Niko looked at him puzzled. What do you mean? I asked you for permission to use your dojo to trade dash. I'm not talking about that, Niko. Don't make a fool out of me. Mitsuyo cut him off abruptly. A scowl on his face. Niko heaved a long sigh before replying truthfully. Even if I had told you about your students' behavior, what would you have planned to do? Expel all, or most of them, from the dojo? Mitsuyo raised an eyebrow. Why not? The last time I checked, I am the founder and owner of the dojo, so I can educate my students as I see fit. Besides, now that I am aware of their conduct towards Izuku-kun, I could really start considering your suggestion. Mitsuyo, listen. I was sure I taught my students that respect is one of the most important foundations in martial arts, but obviously I was wrong. Don't worry, from tomorrow nobody will bother you anymore, you have my war dash. It's part of his training. I beg your pardon. Niko, who until now had been leaning against the wall, got up to approach his interlocutor. It's part of Izuku's training. A mental training of sort, if you prefer. As I told him long ago, and before me his biological father, too, he has to embrace who he is, not be ashamed or feel guilty about it. If he can't bear some insult or mockery, how can he last for more than 2 minutes in the ring or in the midst of a fight against a villain? Mitsuyo's eyes widened. I'm sorry, but, did you just say, ring? Niko did not answer. He just stood there, smiling widely like an idiot. So not only do you want to help Izuku-kun become a hero, but you want to make him an affiliated fighter? Bingo! Mitsuyo groaned, shaking his head. Only you could have come up with such an absurd plan. I'll take that as a compliment, old sport. Old, huh? Are those wrinkles new or have they always been there? Ouch, low blow. The two shared a laugh, starting to recollect the good old days. Mitsuyo. Yes. From a completely professional and impartial point of view, what is your idea of Izuku? Well. He put on a thoughtful expression. Until his face seemed to light up like that of someone who has just had the idea of the century. You know what? Bring him to the dojo tomorrow, I have a plan to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And that would be. This time it was Mitsuyo's turn to smile. You'll see. Scribble 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 scribble. Interesting, what if? Are you done? Almost. Try to hold on a little longer, see Cosmo-kun. I'll try. Currently, at Izuku's great insistence, Cosmo was showing him his quirk. The latter, at least initially, was a little reluctant to the idea given the recent exchange that happened with Izuku, but decided to indulge his new friend. Which brings us to why Cosmo Imai was on the floor in the midst of excruciating stretches that felt painful just to look at them. I take it that your eyes are a direct effect of your quirk, yes? Yup. My tongue too. It's not forked, but it's longer than a normal out person's. Scribble scribble. Izuku. Sorry. You can, untangle yourself now, see Cosmo-kun, thank you very much. Cosmo let out a liberating sigh of relief, and once free from the excruciating position, he slumped to the cold floor. So, Doc, what's the verdict? Cosmo asked with a grin, eliciting a small laugh from Izuku. Well. Cosmo Imai. Quirk. Serpent. Description. Serpent is the summation of Cosmo's many snake-related abilities. Pros. The aforementioned abilities include snake-like anatomy, great flexibility and speed, wall clinging and hardened skin. Cosmo is seemingly capable of using all those skills limitlessly and in combination with one another. Cons. Because of the reptile-like nature of his quirk, when Cosmo is exposed to cold temperatures for too long, he goes into hibernation and is unable to function properly. Your quirk may certainly seem trivial and limited, but it can have numerous applications. Take the mere fact of having an elasticity and flexibility above the norm for example. Izuku exchanged his hero analysis notebook with the one about martial arts. Cosmo-kun, you said you were a jiu-jitsu practitioner, right? Yup. Then there you have it. Put those two things together with your grappling style and your opponent in the ring will have a lot of trouble trying to break free from your holds. Huh. I never thought about it. Flip flip. Izuku started scrolling through the pages, writing something here and there every now and then. Can you produce harmful substances? What? Izuku looked up from the pages, twirling the pen in his fingers. Poisons. Toxins. Neurotoxins. Some reptiles, mainly snakes and lizards, are capable of producing such substances to overcome their small size when they are in danger or facing larger predators. Have you ever tried? Cosmo frowned, thinking deeply. Not really. But hey, I can always try. Izuku smiled and went back to writing in his notebook. Cosmo watched him closely. Then he smiled with a tinge of sadness and shame. I really was an idiot. He was interrupted from his musing by the door of the room, which opened for the umpteenth time to let Niko and Mitsuyo in. After a final exchange of pleasantries, Niko and Izuku left the hospital to go home, not without promising Mitsuyo and Cosmo that they would meet again the next day at the dojo. A few hours later. The Ashura's den. Honestly, I can't believe you. Come on, it's not that bad. Not bad? How can you treat this little angel in such a barbaric way? You know, there is nothing better than a fist fight to build a healthy relationship between father and son. Don't be a smartass, young man. And Nakamura-san, please calm down. And you and Niko, don't make her mad. It was late in the evening. The Ashura's den was packed, as usual. The regulars sat at the tables, having dinner and chatting amicably. Most importantly, they were watching with amusement the scene between Eiko Nakamura, an elderly lady in one of the restaurant's most trusted and loyal regulars, and the owner himself, Niko. In the middle was Izuku, trying to calm the hot spirits, but without much success. Look at little Izuku-chan. His pretty face is covered with plasters, scratches and bruises because of you. Eiko walked over to Niko, making him back against the wall of the counter, and began to point a finger at his chest. What if he got seriously injured? Have you thought about it? Niko made a soothing gesture with his hands, while assuming a thinking expression. Well, there was that time I dislocated his should dash. You what? At that moment, Izuku stepped between the two, exasperated. Nakamura-san, please. And Niko may be a little, rough when we train or fight, but he means well, really. I'm the one who insists on tea training. Izuku looked Eiko in the eye with his deadly puppy look. NGH. Eiko tried to resist Izuku's tenderness, but alas, it was a vain effort. Sighing, she threw one last glare at Niko, who meanwhile was whistling innocently, looking away. You are lucky to have such a lovely child, young man. Niko smiled, ruffling Izuku's hair, who groaned in protest. You can say that, Eiko-san. Humph. Eiko snorted, returning to sit in her place on the counter. You really deserve a good spanking, Niko Tokita. But I'll just have to make you work strong behind the stove. Izuku heaved a sigh of relief, before pouting in Niko's direction, who chuckled sheepishly. You heard the lady, Izuku. I hope you have improved as far as sukiyaki is concerned. Niko smiled mischievously, while Izuku looked like he was on fire. Oh, you're on. After tying his hair in his now trademark man bun, Izuku washed his hands and donned a small apron, helping his adoptive father in the kitchen. Eiko smiled tenderly at the scene. Don't worry, Izuku-chan. Even if it doesn't turn out right, I'd still eat it with gusto. Niko protested. Oh, come on. How come he gets a free pass if he cooks badly, but I have to sit through a lecture dash? But he was hit in the head by a flying slipper. Ow. Quiet, you. Less complaints, more work. Yes. Ma'am. A couple of hours later, the restaurant was now empty. The customers were long gone, their bellies full and satisfied. Eiko was also satisfied with the excellent, or passable, according to Niko, sukiyaki cooked by Izuku. Currently, the two had just finished tidying up and cleaning the place, and while Izuku was relaxing on the counter with a glass of iced tea and reviewing the material Shunka had given him earlier that day, Niko had just started the dishwasher. The man turned, leaning his back against the wall and addressing Izuku. So, what do you think of little Cosmo? Izuku looked up from his notes, but kept twirling the pen between his fingers. Cosmo-kun is very lively. He chuckled. He's also very friendly. He has no problem making new friends and interacting with others, unlike me. I could define him as a real, He began to search through the pages of a book he had nearby. A social butterfly. Niko chuckled. He also seems really good at martial arts, even though I haven't actually seen him in action. I'd like to train with him someday. Izuku felt a hand rest on his fluffy hair, and looked up to see Niko smile at him. So, are you ready to fight someone other than me? Izuku nodded. And what about hurting them? Izuku nodded, but Niko could see the hesitation in the gesture. He sighed, then ruffled the boy's hair. Finish your homework, then go to bed. We have to meet with Mitsuyo in the dojo tomorrow morning. The child nodded again, returning to his studies. Niko looked at him thoughtfully. I hope I'm doing the right thing. The following morning. Kuresi Dojo. The air was tense. The silence was deafening. The room temperature was freezing, even though it was warm outside. Nobody dared to move. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to do anything without the permission of the man who was currently towering in front the myriad of teens. But hey, that's what happens when Mitsuyo Kuresi is pissed off. Do you know why I have summoned you all here? Silence. Well. Silence. Mitsuyo sighed angrily. Okay. I'll speak slowly, so you can all understand me. Mitsuyo paced back and forth in front of his students as if he were a drill sergeant. I haven't been able to notice that lately all of you have been, how to say, a little out of sorts. Erratic. Unreliable. And downright sloppy. Not you, Cosmo. Mitsuyo turned to the blonde at the back of the large group, who flinched as he was called out in front of everyone. You haven't messed up as badly as the others, just slightly, but I assure you it's nothing to celebrate. As for you. The man shifted his fiery glare to the others. To say I'm disappointed would be a monumental understatement. One of the boys, although hesitant, raised a hand to ask permission to speak. Mitsuyo nodded towards him. Sensei, what caused all this? If we did something to make you ma dash. You tell me, Cookie-kun. I don't know dash. No. Too busy hanging out with your gang of rascals causing problems for your neighbors. The boy, Cookie, froze. Mitsuyo gave him one last glare before calling out another student. And what about you, Sora-kun? I noticed that you haven't come to the dojo for a long time. Care to explain? Well, you see, I guess being a full-time bully at your middle school and robbing your classmates is too exhausting. Keep up with dojo attendance, isn't it? Mitsuyo allowed himself to let out a mischievous smile. You think you're so smart, don't you? I'll be honest, you almost fooled me. Almost being the key word. Without taking his eyes off his students, Mitsuyo pointed with his left arm at the large dojo sign on the wall. When I founded this dojo, I did it with the best of intentions in mind, not just as a way to earn money to support myself. I wanted to create a place where I could pass my martial arts down to future generations. I wanted to create a sanctuary where those unable to defend themselves could seize the opportunity to grow as people and become strong enough to fight back. A place where such people could train with the principles of martial arts at heart. Mitsuyo lowered his arm, but his glare only seemed to intensify. But it is clear that I have been too careless in choosing my students. Otherwise I would never have allowed scum like you to enter my dojo. Some of the students had at least had the decency to look down, clearly ashamed. Others did the same, but were mostly angry and frustrated at being caught. And I'll be damned if I let people like you sink what I've built over the years. From now on I expect all of you dash. It. Mitsuyo heard someone mutter something, but couldn't identify who. He approached the group. Does anyone have something to say? Silence. This only made him more angry. So. That's it? You don't even have the courage to talk to me face to face. Wow. I didn't know I had trained such spineless brats. This seemed to struck the right nerve of the culprit, as out of the group, a single person jumped to his feet, clearly angry. Bullshit. Mitsuyo raised an eyebrow, looking at the boy with a completely disinterested air. Kenji-kun, of course. I would love to exclaim that I am surprised, but alas. This last comment only seemed to anger Kenji even more. What do you care about what we do outside the dojo, huh? If we get results here, who cares if we beat up some loser on the street or at school, huh? There were some murmurs of approval from the other students, but Mitsuyo remained unmoved. Wow. I didn't think you could worsen the idiot image I had of you, but you just did, congrats. More murmurs followed by some giggles, but this was the proverbial last straw as Kenji jumped up and walked over to his sensei, grabbing the collar of his shirt. Mitsuyo, as before, remained impassive. What's the point, then? If I can't show off to others, then for what reason did I sign up in this dojo? Maybe you're the one in the wrong, sensei. Kenji slurred the last word, clearly to disrespect Mitsuyo. Some of the boys were silently cheering at Kenji's bravery, others were paralyzed by what might happen between the two. Kenji sneered at Mitsuyo's silence, and decided to rile him up further. Well? What's the matter, sensei? Can't take some criticism from your own student? Should you really be here? Maybe you show dash. Take that arm off me before you lose it. Once again, silence fell in the dojo. But this time the boys felt like they were being crushed by Mitsuyo's DMNT and overwhelming presence. Some of them started shaking like leaves, others literally started dripping with sweat. Kenji, for his part, did neither one nor the other. Instead he just let go of Mitsuyo and backed away with a few wobbly steps. His face, once red with anger, now as white as a sheet. And judging by the pool at his feet and the dark stain on his shorts, he also let go of his bladder. He tried to speak, but he started to gasp like a fish out of the water. Meanwhile, Mitsuyo, whose expression had darkened considerably, approached him. "You said your piece. Now get the F back in line." Kenji nodded furiously and scurried to the back of the group. Once out of sight, Mitsuyo turned to someone else. "Cosmo." The blonde in question flinched again, standing up straight as a pole. "Why yes, sensei." Mitsuyo pointed with the thumb of his right hand behind him, towards the ring. "Get ready. It's almost time." After a few moments of hesitation, Cosmo nodded, pulling away from the group. Mitsuyo moved closer to the other students. He looked at them for a few seconds, his expression unchanged. "You know how I found out about your bullshit outside the dojo?" Amichem. Silence. Simple. "It came to my attention that all of you were pestering the newcomer to the dojo." Silence. But this time, the boys looked at each other, clearly confused. Mitsuyo almost growled. "Izuku? Long green hair. Freckles. Student of the Niko Tokita. Ring a bell?" The students' faces lit up like light bulbs. "Exactly. And don't try to deny it. After discovering this little detail, you can understand that I was livid. Not only because we are talking about the son of a dear friend and colleague of mine, but mainly because you targeted him for the simple fact that he is quirkless." Again, several students looked ashamed, others frustrated. From then on, it wasn't difficult to trace each of you. Especially with my kind of acquaintances. Mitsuyo inhaled and heaved the longest sigh of the week. "To be honest, this lecture has gone for way too long and is starting to tire me. Now, you have two options. You can pull your heads out of your asses and learn some DMN manners or..." He pointed at the entrance to the dojo. "You know where the exit is. I assure you that none of you will be missed, gentlemen." He started to reach Cosmo, but he turned to the boys one last time. "And just to be clear. If I hear from anyone that you used my martial arts to bully or hurt someone for whatever bullshit reason, you will regret not walking out that door when you could." And with that, Mitsuyo Kuresi left his students. A few minutes later, Izuku and Niko entered the dojo, and after getting ready in the locker room, they headed for the ring. Izuku noticed in surprise that the place was already occupied by Cosmo, who was in the midst of some stretches, and Mitsuyo, who watched his pupil as he leaned on the ring ropes. The boy's expression brightened when he saw his new friend, and he walked over to greet him properly. Niko did the same with Mitsuyo, but he couldn't help but notice the grim expression on his face or more generally the tense atmosphere of the dojo. Mitsuyo noticed the man approaching, and finally his expression softened, greeting his friend with a smile and a nod. "Hey, Niko. Good morning." Niko replied politely, joining him near the ropes. "Good morning, Mitsuyo. Or is what I'd like to say. Something happened between you." He turned, and noticed that the other boys in the dojo were busy with their training with more enthusiasm than usual. But what fueled this commitment was not anger or determination, but fear and shame, perhaps. And the boys? Mitsuyo didn't even deign to look at them. "Yes, but I won't go into details. Like I said yesterday, no one will bother you in here anymore." Niko sighed, but Mitsuyo continued. "It will take a long time for them to regain my trust and my respect." "I see." Intent on changing the subject, Mitsuyo decided to clarify why he had invited Niko and Izuku to the dojo. "You want to make them fight." But he was beaten to it. Mitsuyo raised his eyebrows, surprised. "I don't have to turn around and look at you to see the surprised expression on your face. I almost felt your brows rise." Niko groaned, while Mitsuyo let out a chuckle. Sorry. I should think twice before underestimating you, old friend." The two looked at the two boys in the ring, who were talking, laughing and joking amicably. Niko smiled forlornly. "Come on. Let's start." His partner nodded and motioned the two boys to come closer. "I don't know about this, Niko." Currently, Izuku was in the red corner of the ring, while Cosmo occupied the blue one. Both fighters had their senseis nearby, intent on giving last-minute advice to their pupils. "Relax, Izuku. What's so different from our sparring sessions? Use what you have learned and what I have taught you at the right time and you will have no problems." This did little to reassure the boy. "I know but..." Niko sighed. "Izuku, last night you told me that you wouldn't hesitate." Izuku flinched. Niko was right. He had given his word. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't disappoint Niko like that. Not now. Izuku closed his eyes and began taking a series of controlled breaths to calm down. "Okay, why yes. I got this. I can do it." Niko smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Good boy." Both Niko and Mitsuyo walked away, going to sit on one of the benches near the ring. One of the older boys got into the ring to referee, and called the two fighters. "Fighters, get ready." Izuku and Cosmo left their respective corner posts, approaching the center of the ring. "Take your stances." Cosmo adopted a classic grappler stance, while Izuku took the Niko-style stance. "Get ready." Izuku did not take his eyes off Cosmo, and Cosmo did the same. They exchanged a last smile and nod. And then, "Begin." They charged at each other. Cosmo changed his stance at the last minute, going from grappling to attacking, throwing a series of quick punches at the opponent. Izuku, although taken by surprise, had time to put his arms in a high defensive position, tanking Cosmo's strikes. However, his opponent had no intention of giving him respite, and he continued his assault. Izuku, surprised by the constant assault, continued to tank, feeling pain in his forearms. "He's a good tank," Cosmo thought. "But he can't last forever." The blonde intensified his assault even further, pushing Izuku towards the ropes, trapping him. "Don't get cornered, Izuku." Niko yelled from the bench, and this seemed to wake Izuku from his stupor. Izuku stepped away from the ropes, standing straight and anchored firmly in the ring with his feet. His face contorted with pain. "Endure." I didn't think he was so tough." "Endure." "Come on, give in." "Endure." "Give in." "Endure." "Ugh. Arg." Cosmo suddenly stopped his attacks, stepping away from Izuku by jumping backwards a couple of times, putting a lot of distance between them. Huff ANF Huff DMN it. Huff. Cosmo did not release his stance, but he was clearly exhausted from the assault he had launched against his opponent. He took a few seconds to catch his breath, watching Izuku in the meantime. The boy in question was still with his arms raised, but they were trembling and red. Several bruises were already in the process of forming. He lowered his arms slightly, adopting a neutral stance. He too was out of breath, but it was due more to mask his pain than fatigue. He looked at his feet for a moment, then returned his attention to Cosmo. "And to think I burst out laughing when he mentioned the tree thing. Niko style. Adamantine kata. Indestructible." This technique allows the user to either defend from powerful blows or attack the opponent in a powerful attack, through instantaneously clenching all of their muscles at the moment of impact. Tensing and tightening of the muscles increases the solidity and density of the user's body, thus preventing the impact of outside attacks from inflicting much, if any, damage. This gives the technique massive defensive and offensive power. By the user also picturing themselves as if they are rooted to the ground like a tree, the technique has the capability to withstand blows from opponents up to a certain weight limit. However, indestructible is not infallible and can be broken through by colossal blows that are overwhelmingly powerful or by powerful attacks that can gradually wear indestructible down. Izuku shook his arms to try to relieve the pain and soreness. Then he resumed his attack position. Just then, Cosmo recovered too, and didn't hesitate to charge at Izuku again. The latter tried to intercept him with a kick to Cosmo's left side, but the blonde was quicker to react, counterattacking with a kick to Izuku's left kneecap, throwing him off balance. NGH. Izuku fell from the blow, but before he hit the ground, he was kicked again, this time in the abdomen. He became aware of the impending attack too late and could not harden his muscles in time. Irk. Ironically, the blow he received served to keep him from meeting the mat with his face, and he got back on his feet. However, the kick was strong enough to make Izuku spit some saliva on the mat. He may be small in stature, but he hits really strong. Cosmo didn't give his opponent a moment of recovery, quickly approaching to hit him. Izuku threw a punch with his left arm, but Cosmo dodged by sliding down and hitting him with a kick behind his left knee. And he's fast too. Once again, Izuku was thrown off balance, but remained standing, much to Cosmo's annoyance. You don't want to go down, huh? So. Fight back, Izuku. Don't let him push you around. Niko tried to spur Izuku to react, but it was too late. Scissor throw. Jujutsu. Scissor throw. Also known as leg scissors, or scissor kick, this technique gets its name from the fact that the legs of the user resemble scissors when employed. Scissor throw is not a technique exclusive to Jujutsu, being used in other martial arts, both Western, wrestling and capoeira, and Eastern, taekwondo, bovinum, kung fu, silat and judo. Trapping the opponent between his legs, the user then proceeds to perform a twisting movement with the whole body, unbalancing the opponent and throwing him to the ground. Completely at his mercy, the user can decide whether to follow with a grappling or SBMSN technique or continue to mount the opponent and hit him. Cosmo fell back on the ground, balancing with his left forearm. Then he lowered the rest of his body and used his legs to trap Izuku's, immobilizing him. Gotcha. Finally, he violently twisted his body clockwise, knocking Izuku to the ground. With his legs still entangled with his opponent's, the two began a fierce ground fight. Izuku started struggling in an attempt to free himself, but it was completely useless. Cosmo released his left leg, and planted his knee firmly on Izuku's sternum, being careful not to apply too much pressure. After that, he freed his other leg from Izuku's, placing them both at the opponent's hips. No. Cosmo smiled triumphantly. Mount complete. Niko watched the unfolding of the fight carefully, not letting go of any detail, even the smallest and most insignificant one. In particular, he noted Izuku's extremely passive approach to the match. Sure, when the two of them were fighting, he was definitely more inclined to attack than to defend, but against someone else? He was hesitating. Which wasn't good. Niko watched Cosmo finish the mount on Izuku, who was thus totally at the mercy of the opponent. Ground fighting and grappling are Cosmo's strong points. Niko closed his eyes. What will you do now, Izuku? Will you hesitate? Then he opened them, focusing on his pupil. Or will you fight? I don't like bragging, but now we're in my field, Izuku-kun. Slam! Slam! Cosmo exclaimed as he repeatedly punched Izuku, who as before was defending himself with his arms raised. Wham! Wham! This position is fatal for strikers like you. NGH. He's right. Izuku thought as he endured Cosmo's punches as much as possible. Think. Right now I have a limited range of motion. And my hips are immobilized, preventing me from delivering full-body strikes. Think. I can't rely on indestructible. I've abused it before and can't absorb damage for much longer. Think. Iron Breaker? No. I don't have enough room to deliver an effective blow. Think. No moves of the redirection kata are applicable in this situation. Think. Okay, I have no other choice. I haven't fully mastered that move yet, but it's worth trying. Izuku extended his right arm to the side with his fist still closed, surprising Cosmo, as well as Niko and Mitsuyo. After that, he opened his hand, but closed it again soon after. He left only 2 fingers, the index and middle fingers, extended. Niko's eyes widened. Don't tell me. Mitsuyo cracked a smile with closed eyes. Excellent choice, Niko. Cosmo just stared at Izuku, confused. What is he doing? Izuku looked Cosmo in the eye. I'm sorry, Cosmo-kun. Jab. Ga. Cosmo leapt out of his mounting position, clutching his left side. Izuku took the opportunity to get up, once again shaking his sore forearms. I have to seriously start building muscle. Ow wow. Izuku looked up at his opponent, who was intent on massaging his sore side. Lifting his shirt, he already noticed a large, newly formed bruise. What? Are you kidding me? You just poked me with 2 fingers and you hurt me this much? How is that possible? Izuku shyly raised his hand, extending his index and middle fingers. Niko style. Adamantine kata. Iron fingers. A technique that involves tightening the muscles in the fingers, thereby hardening the joints of the fingers. This is an extremely versatile technique and can be used as a jabbing attack against the opponent's vitals, as a pinching hold, or even to enable movement of the fingers even if they are broken. Sorry, Cosmo-kun. Izuku lowered his hand, resuming his starting stance. His eyes, now sharp and attentive, studied his opponent carefully. But I can still go on. Cosmo replied with a broad smile. He returned to his initial stance. They exchanged a last smile and a nod. And then. That's enough. They both fell to the ground. They stood up, confused, and glanced at Mitsuyo, who was making a break time gesture with his hands. Huh. Oh, come on. Later. I almost had him, sensei. Cosmo pouted indignantly. He touched you with 2 fingers and you jumped as if he had stabbed you, Cos. He almost gutted me with those 2 fingers. Mitsuyo smiled. Anyway, you have school tomorrow, so let's stop here. I don't need you to show up in class all battered and bruised. Again. NGH. You. Cosmo began to vibrate with upset, but then sighed defeated. You're so lucky you don't go to school, Izuku-kun. Izuku, who was treating his forearms with ice packs, approached the 2. Don't say that, see Cosmo-kun. Going to school is important. Cosmo squirmed in place, still restless from the fight. Anyway. The blonde approached Izuku, pointing a finger at him. Why yes. Cosmo narrowed his eyes. This time sensei stopped the fight. But. Next time we'll fight properly. He began to poke Izuku with his finger repeatedly. So don't slack off with your training. Get stronger. I'll do the same. Then we'll see who's the best fighter. Ow. Oh okay, Cosmo-kun. I promise yo ow. See, can you stop poking me? It's payback time. Niko stepped between the 2, chuckling at the scene. Okay, that's enough, boys. Izuku, let's go home. You have your lesson with Shunka waiting for you. Izuku nodded, and together with Niko, they left the dojo. Cosmo went to clean up in the locker room, leaving Mitsuyo alone with the other students, who were still with their jaws under their feet after seeing Izuku and Cosmo fight. Without even facing them, Mitsuyo addressed students. Now, my dear pupils, how many of you have managed to stand up to and withstand one of Cosmo's flurry of strikes? Silence. How many of you have managed to get free from one of his mounts? Silence. How many of you managed not to be knocked down 1 minute into the match? Silence. Finally, he turned to them. His grin was comparable to Niko's. Never judge a book by its cover, boys. Later that evening. The Ashura's den. It was late in the evening, and in the apartment above the restaurant, Niko was tucking Izuku into bed. You did well today. The way you used iron fingers to free yourself from Cosmo's mount was nothing short of phenomenal. Izuku blushed at the compliment, sinking slightly into the covers. Really? Niko smiled. Really? Izuku smiled back. Silence fell between the two. Niko's expression darkened. Not with anger. But sadness. Izuku immediately noticed the man's abnormal behavior, and turned to him, concerned. Niko? Are you okay? The man did not answer, just closed his eyes. Niko? Nothing. Okay. Now Izuku was really worried. Niko, please. Do you trust me? What? What? Niko opened his eyes, they still had that little bit of melancholy inside them, and he repeated the question. Izuku, do you trust me? The boy stood there, trying to figure out where Niko was going with this bizarre question. Of course I trust you, Niko. Why are you asking me? Again, Niko didn't answer. He just reached out and tousled Izuku's hair. Don't think about it. Now rest. We'll take a week off from training. A week? Niko, yo. Good night, Izuku. And so, Niko left the room of the boy, who in the meantime was completely stunned. Deciding that there was nothing he could do about it right now, Izuku snuggled up in the blankets of his futon and closed his eyes, thinking one last time about Niko. What's wrong with him? A week later. Unknown location. And so, after a week off, apart from studying afternoons with Shunka and Izuku's morning shadow boxing sessions, Niko and Izuku found themselves on top of a grassy hill. They had woken up quite early that day, and after a hearty breakfast, Niko took Izuku with him, loading a huge backpack into the van. Throughout the journey, he did not speak a word to Izuku. To tell the truth, he didn't speak to Izuku all week, except when absolutely necessary. It was all very strange. And wrong. Looking out over the horizon, Izuku noticed what looked like a city. A city that seemed somewhat familiar. See. Izuku heard a long sigh from his right, and noticed Niko staring down at the ground. Before he could speak, the man turned to him. Izuku. His tone sharp as a knife. Izuku flinched. Why yes. Niko gestured his head towards the city in the distance. Do you know what that is? Izuku looked at the city for a few moments before answering. A CCIT. Wrong. Niko approaching Izuku. That's not a city. Not just any city at least. Gulp. Izuku swallowed. Niko did not look away from him in the slightest. That. It's the inside. Izuku's eyes widened. Then he turned to the city on the horizon. The inside. Niko nodded. Exactly. In particular, that is the northernmost district. It is called Rikuko. It borders to the east with the Shiki district, to the south with the Goyu district, to the southwest with the Kumo district and southeast with the Ratsa district. Okay. Silence fell again between the two. Niko kept staring at Izuku, but the latter could no longer handle the man's abnormal behavior. And Niko, why are we here? Because here and now, Izuku. Niko stood up. He went to his van and pulled out the backpack he had prepared that morning, then placed it at Izuku's feet. The penultimate phase of your training begins. Izuku stared at the giant backpack, then nodded. Okay. I understand. What exactly do we have ? We don't have to do anything, Izuku. Niko's emphasis on "we" made the boy shiver. Now it's your turn. Izuku stared Niko in the face, trying to read his expression. What should I do, Niko? The man stared at the boy for an unpleasant amount of time. Survive. Niko sighed deeply, then crouched down in front of Izuku. He reached down and gently placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. His expression softened considerably. For a whole year, Izuku, you must survive in the inside. Alone. It took a few seconds for Izuku to understand the words Niko was speaking to him. You won't get any help from me, other than the backpack and what it contains. Izuku looked down, starting to tremble. But, why? Because it is necessary, Izuku. Izuku continued to stare at his feet. Niko continued. You can't afford to hesitate, Izuku. Not now, not ever. Not in everyday life, not in the ring, not when dealing with villains. Izuku, remember. Niko moved his hands from his shoulders to the boy's face, lifting him up to make them see each other face to face. Izuku had unshed tears in his eyes. Hesitation is defeat. Hesitation is death. Izuku could no longer contain himself, and let the tears go. Izuku. Sniff hic. Izuku, talk to me dash. Are you abandoning me? Why you, hic. Izuku felt like he was suffocating, putting a hand to his chest and squeezing it tightly. But he was immediately wrapped by Niko in a hug. The man began to tenderly slide Izuku's hair, trying to calm him down. Disappointed why you? I'm sorry sniff. I'm so sorry, Niko. Don't dash. Don't ever say that again. Niko's stern tone made Izuku jump and stop immediately. The child relaxed in the man's embrace, calming down slightly. Izuku, I want one thing to be clear to you. I am in no way, and I repeat, in no way, disappointed in you. You are a wonderful little boy. And for this very reason the very idea of leaving you alone for a whole year in that. Niko struggled to find the right words. That shithole makes my guts twist. Believe me when I tell you it's necessary. I'm not happier than you are about this, but I have no choice. He let the boy go, then wiped the tears off his cheeks with his thumbs. He smiled tenderly at Izuku. A quirk is nothing, son. The power of a person, any person, comes from here. He poked Izuku's chest, where his heart was. Before he could finish, Izuku spoke. But only when tempered by the discipline and the self-control of the one who wields it. Then he poked Niko's forehead. The two stood staring, before bursting into chuckling. Niko ruffled Izuku's hair. You are strong, Izuku. I know you can do it. Izuku backed away from Niko's touch. Then he took a deep breath. He raised his hands. He stood still. Slap. And he slapped both cheeks. Niko watched the scene with a raised eyebrow, clearly confused. Izuku instead shook his head violently and went back to his MSTR. His eyes were still shiny from the tears and he still had some snot in his nose. Niko. The man nodded. Yes. Izuku began to tremble again, but he endured. He clenched his fists. I would lie to you if I told you I want to do it. I would lie to you if I told you that I am not afraid. I would lie to you if I told you that I would not want to throw in the towel and go home with you. But. He took another breath to calm down. But if I gave up now, after everything we've done, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. I'd spit on everything you've done for me. He walked over to Niko. I'd spit on the promise I made to you. The promise I made to Seishu-san. The promise I made to all the good people of the Ashura's den. The promise I made to Cosmo. The promise I made to Mom and Dad. Izuku let out a whimper. Then he reached out with his closed fist, and touched Niko on the left cheekbone, as if wanting to punch him. SSO. If I don't make it dash. You will make it. Niko cut him off abruptly, but Izuku continued. If I don't make it, I just want to tell you. Izuku wiped his face clean once and for all. Then he picked up the backpack and put it on his shoulder. Finally he looked Niko in the eye. Thanks for everything, Dad. Then he nodded, turned and started walking towards Rikuko. Niko watched Izuku's figure shrink on the horizon. Once he was completely gone, he fell to the ground. He dragged a hand along his face. Then he smiled, albeit wobbly. Then he chuckled sadly. A single, tiny tear fell from one eye. Izuku, you. He looked up at Rikuko. I am the one who should be thanking you. He got to his feet. Then he looked up at the sky. Did I do the right thing, Gayo-sensei? So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author the Nexus 97 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.